All right, this is the video on the ratification of the the Treaty of Versailles. Now, when we talk about, first of all, the treaty was signed, was argued in Europe, and Wilson, who had hoped to make it based on his 14 points, actually wound up in a situation where very few of the 15 points got in. But where Wilson's greatest achievement, or where he would say his greatest achievement is the idea that although many of his other 14 points had to go away, Wilson, I think, really felt like his major achievement, his major thing he wanted to accomplish, was to get the League of Nations established. The first 26 articles of the Treaty of Versailles, which is 200 and some articles long, is a covenant for the League of Nations. Now, when we talk about this, the struggle over the ratification in the United States, the debate over the Treaty of Versailles really has to do with more of the League of Nations than anything else. A lot of the hyphenated Americans were mad about different parts of the treaties that had little to do with the League. But the debate that centered in the Senate between the senators and with Woodrow Wilson had everything to do with the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is basically a covenant between all of the nations that join that agree with selective security. And so the idea here then is, how should the U.S. behave in the world? And what we find is that most senators, and this is just one of the things that we have to go over really quick, most senators, most people in the United States believe the U.S. needed to play a role as an internationalist, that they would be out in the world working with other nations and putting forth what is best for the United States. Now, one of the things that we have to look at is that there were three different perspectives on how the U.S. should behave. And we're going to take a look at the three groups of senators that held these three perspectives. The irreconcilables, Reed, Borah, Hiram Johnson, Robert La Follette from Minnesota. They believe that the United States should have no obligations to any country and should not have alliances in Europe. They even sometimes talked about having alliances in different places. Some of these senators were pretty much oddballs, but most of them were great speakers, were well respected, and had this belief because they believed that the United States needed to continue to be set aside. And really, World War I kind of proves their point, as it was about land and money and power. Senator William Borah said that we cannot send our representatives to deliberate with representatives of the great nations of the world with mental reservations as to what we shall do in the case that their judgment shall not be satisfactory to us. They tell us the League of Nations will be a great brotherhood of nations assembled, and that when the nations are assembled together, they will be a body devoted to the service of God and man without a single selfish thought or single questionable motive. Yet at the close of war, many of those same countries that we are now told will liberate nations and bring democracy to the people of the world seized every foot of territory that was held by helpless people anywhere. He's basically saying in the end there that these people that tell us that we will make the world safe are the ones that were bickering over territory, bickering over money, bickering over these things and to punish Germany. And so he's questioning whether we should be involved with these countries at all. The second group is the strong reservationists, and this is really Henry Cabot Lodge, who's the leader of the head of the Foreign Relations Committee. He said, if the League ever adopts a plan to reduce armaments, the U.S. must reserve the right to increase its armaments without consent of the Council. He believed that the League would threaten U.S. sovereignty by requiring the U.S. to follow directions from an international body And so all the decisions of the League must be suggestions only in his idea. That if we go ahead and commit ourselves to the League, it is unconstitutional because we are taking many powers away from the Senate and putting them in the representative of the League. And we are allowing that the United States would be somewhat governed by this League of Nations. And this is where his distrust of Wilson plays in, is because he felt like the president would have way too much power with how the League would work. Then you have the Progressive Internationalists that was led by Wilson. And Wilson's idea was that any changes to the League of Covenant are a rejection of the League. It is my purpose to vote against the pending resolution of ratification incorporating reservationists adopted by a majority of senators. I believe the Senate is about to vote on an alleged resolution of ratification, a resolution that does not ratify, but which in fact, in legal effect, constitutes a rejection of the treaty. He's basically saying that if you try to change the League of Nations, you are defeating the League of Nations, and you are saying that we do not want to be a part of it. He believed that this is what America had dreamed of, that this was America's dream. He believed in the treaty as it now stands, and the League of Nations will ensure the peace by creating organizations to solve the world's problems. He believed that this was the way the United States should behave. This is the way the United States should go about it. Now, what I want to do is go over some of just the major events, kind of run through a timeline of what the League is going to look like, or what the debate of the League looked like. We will spend time looking at the actual treaty and looking at this, but you can see from these three groups that they all had a very determined ideas of the way they thought the world should work. So you got the irreconcilables that say the U.S. should not behave in the world. You got the stronger reservationists and mild reservationists are also in this group, and they believe that the United States should be a part of what's going on in the world. They should be a part of it. The strong reservationists think the United States should really pursue its own needs and own ideas, whereas the mild reservationists only had a few problems with the League and were okay if the United States were to join the League, but had some questions about it, whereas the strong internationalists were ready to move forward as written. So here's Woodrow Wilson addressing the Senate. So his idea is, our isolation ended 20 years ago. So our isolation ended 20 years ago, is what he says. Should be pointed right there. And then different people all over the floor would have agreed. Most senators were in favor of some type of league, of some type of the United States being involved. And yet, on March 19th, 1920, the treaty with 14 reservations put by Lodge falls short. Then again, they vote. And a Senate voting on the treaty as is failed, or passed the resolution 49-35, but failed to get the majority of votes, 7 votes, that would have swayed the public, that would have swayed the vote to get ratification. So the League of Nations, which could have prevented World War II, fails by 7 votes. And so we need to take a really good look at why this happens. This might be the biggest blunder in American history. Lodge, head of the Foreign Relations Committee. The treaty read to the public and then spent 6 weeks of public hearings. And then the irreconcilables launched a partisan attack. In each of these cases, Lodge, when he's looking at the Foreign Relations Committee, has created a situation where he has put forth a situation where he's in control of the Foreign Relations Committee. And so he can set how the Foreign Relations Committee is going to go about the treaty. Now, very rarely, he spent 3 days just reading the treaty. Each day they would read, they'd take a recess, they'd keep reading, and they read the entire thing out loud, despite the fact that everybody on the committee and most of the people that were at the hearing have already read the treaty. Then spent 6 weeks of public hearings from anybody that wanted to talk about it. While these 6 weeks is going on, the irreconcilables, Senator Borah, La Follette, and others were out there launching a partisan attack on the treaty. Now, as many of you know, when you are trying to go against an idea, you only bring up the parts that help your argument, and then you kind of exaggerate. When you're trying to convince your parents of something, you exaggerate things so that they will. Then you can come to a much more agreement on basically what is the reality. And that's what happens a lot with these groups. They're out there going about it. And if you could see this cartoon, you'd see the treaty is battered. And this is La Follette right here, basically trying to rescue, according to Lodge, would try to rescue the treaty. But in each case, you could see that the operating room, Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and that the treaty just gets beat up by this group and then comes forward. Right here, Wilson hears that the committee is trying to change the treaty, and he believes that if he can sit down and discuss with this group. So on August 19th, so the committee went over July 17th to July 31st. And that's pretty much when the committee was in control of the treaty. August 19th, the Foreign Relations Committee accepted Wilson's invitation to discuss the treaty. They go over every single part of the treaty, and Wilson goes through Article 10, goes through how the United States would be on a security committee, goes through all their concerns with the hope that he would convince them that it was that the United States would not wind up going into war despite themselves. They would have a vote, and if they voted no, they wouldn't go to war. And so the United States was still very much in control. But these senators would not be swayed. Many of these senators were afraid or did not want to go to war, or did not want the League, and so this was a way to defeat the League. And so despite the fact that Wilson really tried to convince them that these reservations were not a problem, or that none of the League issues were really a problem, and that the reservations that they wanted to put on the League covenant were not necessarily, did not necessarily need to be there. But despite this, Lodge right here believes that, or continues to work against the treaty. Lodge himself very much felt like, or did not like Wilson. They were both scholars in politics, and had a life in which they had a personal rivalry and a political rivalry on the national stage for a long, long time. And so they very much disliked each other and did not want the other one to get any kind of credit. And so that has to be considered as we look at the rest of these actions, that the two of them hated each other. Okay, what we see here is Wilson's last attempt, or Wilson's attempt to try and go around the Senate and straight to the American people. Wilson believed that if they change the League covenant, they reject the League. And so for him, the 14 reservations, which the majority of those reservations were put upon Lodge, that he felt like would change the treaty forever. So Wilson goes on the speaking tour. Wilson spends 22 days, travels 8,000 miles, visited 29 cities, and made 40 speeches. And you could see by this map that the journey that he was taking was a long and a very ambitious trip, that his doctor basically said no, he should not do this. But the speeches themselves were very popular among the American people. Many people in the United States started writing their senators saying that they wanted this passed, and they wanted this to happen. Now, during this trip on September 10, the Republicans came out of the committee and recommended that the Senate with 44 amendments to the treaty. And the 44 amendments was a tremendous amount and somewhat ridiculous. The converse, the other plan that Hitchcock, who was kind of a mild reservationist, who had worked with Wilson on this, Hitchcock was the Democratic leader in the Senate, put forth 6 amendments. And so we have these two amendments. And we have these two groups, 44 and 6. And obviously, that is a long way to go to compromise. Well, while that's happening on September 25th, Wilson collapses. They collapse. Okay, his speeches seem to make an impact because he did not want to compromise at all, because he saw this as a prerogative of the president, and because he did not want to compromise. He saw that the foreign policy was the prerogative of the president. He shouldn't have to go to the Senate. He shouldn't have to change the way things are done. And so he moved forward on that idea. Okay, the situation here, as we move towards the end, is that Wilson suffered a stroke. After he collapsed on the 25th, he suffers a stroke on October 2nd, a major stroke. And this changes things. Many people blame that stroke on the reason it failed, because he would no longer work or wanted to compromise. He told Hitchcock on November 7th, let Lodge compromise. On November 19th, the Senate rejects a treaty with 14 Lodge reservations. Now, why did Lodge go from 44 to 14? And the idea there is that he went from 44 to 14 as a political maneuver, I think, is what we have to come to the conclusion of, is the idea of going 44 to 14 gives Wilson, or gives Lodge, the idea that he was the one that was willing to compromise. He was the one that was willing to work. He was the one that was willing to come to the table, when in all circumstances the 44 reservations were made up as more of a political maneuver than actually something. And so Lodge wants the credit to be the compromiser, and Wilson tells Hitchcock, let Lodge compromise.
Don't look at me like that.
Okay. So Wilson has that stroke that I was talking about, refuses to compromise, and Hitchcock proposes the Senate 5 mild reservations that centered around Article 10, because Article 10 is really the issue. Article 10 itself says that that all League members will protect the borders of other nations, and they protect it first by a strong worded letter, comments saying that the nation needs to get back. Then they do economic sanctions, and then if needed, they would go and use force. And the idea was they would draw from the armies of the different member nations. Well, in this case, the United States assumes no obligation to employ its military or naval forces or the economic boycott to preserve territorial integrity or political independence. This is what Hitchcock put forward, was this idea that the United States would assume no obligation within that. With that one reservation, and Taft, William Howard Taft, former president, also puts forth another idea to take Article 10, that the United States would not be there would be no binding obligations to Article 10. So the idea was that if they amended Article 10, then they would be able to do this. But they never took a vote on these, because either the Republicans rejected it or Wilson went against it and voted and defeated any type of vote on this. So what we come to is that November 19th, 1919, Senate rejects the treaty with 14 reservations, 39 to 55. Then the Senate rejects the original treaty, 38 to 58. On February 1st, 1920, England and France declared they would accept the Senate reservations. And yet, on March 19th, 1920, the Senate defeats the treaty with Lodge's 14 reservations, 49 to 35. They needed 56 votes. They take it on the original treaty and they get the same. Wilson talked about a lot of his people, and so he would veto it. Congress then attempts to end the war by a joint resolution, but that's vetoed by Wilson. And Wilson says that the 1920 elections between a Democrat and a Republican would then decide whether the public wanted the treaty. The Republicans wanted a landslide, and so therefore, by 7 votes, the United States rejects the Treaty of Versailles and does not join. Thank you.